All right. I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen with the presentation on it. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Welcome to the newest installment of our Advocacy 101 series. As you probably have gathered, today's session is on the zoning ordinance. So just before we get started, I just wanted to give a little preface. Thank you all again for coming. If you guys are not familiar with our organization, we are Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy. We are a membership-based, volunteer-driven nonprofit with a mission to inspire, motivate, and engage people to protect, preserve, and restore wildlife habitat. So like I said before, thank you for coming, and we're going to hop right in to giving you guys some background knowledge on one of the county's biggest current projects. So what is zoning? You guys have probably heard the term thrown around a few times, especially since the installment of the newest comprehensive plan back in 2019. So just to give you a brief overview, to define zoning, there was a study done. It was the University of Wisconsin that gave a really concise definition of zoning. Also, just a quick heads up, if anyone could mute their mics, that would be great. I don't have the ability to see the screen right now since I'm sharing. Just to minimize background noise, that would be amazing. Thank you. Yeah, so to define zoning, zoning is the way that governments control the physical development of the land and the kinds of uses to which each individual property may be put. In Loudoun County, specifically, Loudoun County cites the zoning ordinance as the primary implementation tool for the 2019 comprehensive plan, which is a policy document that provides guidance for elected officials and other governmental decision makers as to where and how the community will grow long term. The zoning ordinance itself is the regulatory document that has legal requirements that are necessary to implement some of those comprehensive plan processes. And this visual over here on the right-hand side of the screen just shows you some of the other documents that are relevant to the comprehensive plan policy. The zoning ordinance, of course, being the one that we are going to dive into today. So this is an Advocacy 101 session. So with regards to zoning, why is it a big deal for advocacy? We have said before that it is one of the county's biggest projects right now, but why should you as an environmental and wildlife advocate care about it? So as we said before, this is really closely tied to the 2019 comprehensive plan. There was a lot of good language that was included in the comprehensive plan to protect wildlife and ensure some environmental protection. But it doesn't mean a whole lot if there aren't any actual regulations in place to implement and enforce those policies. So what we're doing here is we are asking for these things to be implemented in a very concise language that makes it possible for the county to actually implement and enforce those policies in the comprehensive plan. And advocating for the enforcement of the language that was already included is important. If you guys have been here for previous sessions, we talked about the importance of consistency throughout the process, and this is just one more element of actually ensuring that wildlife protection happens throughout the process, the public process in the county. So with regards specifically to Loudoun County, the zoning ordinance regulations in Loudoun County set the standard for what is allowed where in the county, but also for what is allowed where and on what conditions. So this map over here in this corner just shows you some distributions of the use types, and a little visual representation of how the county might be broken up with regards to, like said, what is allowed where. So it's incredibly important that we as environmental advocates encourage the incorporation of language and content in the zoning ordinance that serves the best interests of wildlife for a multitude of reasons. It allows solid ground to stand on when developers come knocking. Official language can be referred to when pushing back against development applications that may harm wildlife habitat. It allows for standards when development projects are approved, i.e. that might be something to do with the removal of invasive species when a horticulture assignment is made. Requiring replacements of trees that are cleared, requiring that the trees be replaced with native trees, requiring that native plants be used in horticulture with new building developments. There's also the element of disallowing especially ecologically damaging development practices. So trying to prevent some of those really degrading practices that might be happening in some environmentally sensitive areas. And a good example is preventing things such as certain types of recreation or development in floodplains. This also just generally a good way to protect wildlife needs. So we've talked a lot about dark skies. That is something else that is implemented and it calls to zoning regulations with regard to those what conditions like spoken about earlier. We talk about contiguous habitat. This is a very big element of that, making sure that there is open space that allows for contiguous habitat throughout the county. It also does wonders for preventing loopholes that might allow for some kind of unnecessary environmental degradation. The last thing that I have is there's lots of different important uses like said, oh, whoops. But there is also the element of limiting development free reign as much as possible. So placing restrictions that really do put those environmental protections in place and make sure that developers know that they just can't put anything they want anywhere they want without regard for environmental or societal conditions. So the incorporation of environmental language in the zoning ordinance rewrite also encourages the county to employ resources to protect the environment. A big part of this is the heightened involvement and the onboarding of trained environmental professionals into the county staff, biologists, natural resource specialists as actual county staff members. They'll be very vital resources for protection of wildlife and wildlife habitat going forward, especially in how fast our county is developing. So just to start diving into the actual process for the zoning ordinance rewrite. The zoning ordinance rewrite was originally called the zoning ordinance overhaul, but the county decided that the acronym ZOO probably wasn't the best image. So they did rename it to ZOR. And our guest speaker tonight decided that the graphic needed a little bit more of an edge to it. So she created this very interesting photo with a bit of a Game of Thrones theme onto it. And I like to make the joke that it's called the ZOR because the name Zork was already taken. I don't know if there's any Parks and Rec fans in the audience, but those in the weeds really refer to it as the ZOR or the ZORP. And that was one of the first things that came to mind to me. All that being said, if the zoning ordinance rewrite is known as the ZOR, and the focus areas and reasoning for the rewrite have a lot of really big focal areas that are important for wildlife conservation, but also for, like said, the implementation of that county plan. So I'm going to actually just read off some of the focus areas and the reasoning for the zoning ordinance rewrite that is stated by the county, just to give you guys some of that background. So the first one is the implementation of a new comprehensive plan vision, including as the urban policy area, which is involving new place types with newly updated densities, standards, building forms, and infrastructure that are going to come to be realized in Loudoun County. The second element is modernization. So revising land uses and definitions to reflect the current marketplace. reevaluating parking ratios and calculations, updating lot and building standards, and aligning with how county administrates planned unit developments with modern practice. So giving regard to those changes that has happened in the county since 1993. There's also the consistency audit, so analyzing existing standards and striving for consistency within the document across zoning districts as much as is feasible. Structure and flow, so improving the document structure from that 1993 version to make it more user-friendly and clear to the general public. To address opportunities and challenges, so evaluating input from stakeholders about the current zoning ordinance and making improvements where appropriate. And then the last element was legislation. So incorporating changes based on new or revised provisions of the Code of Virginia, court cases, and best management practices promoted by the Virginia Association of Zoning Officials, Urban Land Institute, and American Planning Association. So to sum up, just generally, this rewrite process is happening for a multitude of reasons. A lot has happened since 1993, as I'm sure most of you are aware. And there is a lot of reasoning behind the zoning ordinance rewrite taking place. So just to hop right into the actual process, I did want to take a quick second to go over some of the steps of a typical development application. If any of you guys were here for our last Advocacy 101 session, you'll know that we actually went through the process of a development application in the county government, and we went through the steps that it takes to get there. So the zoning ordinance rewrite went through a similar but not exactly identical process. However, understanding this framework will give you an idea of how the process has come so far. So just to give a little review, phase one is the info gathering and community involvement. It's known as pre-application. Phase two is when the application is submitted. Phase three is the referral process in which various groups throughout the county government give input on the application. Phase four is going to the Planning Commission, in which there are public hearings and work sessions. Planning Commission does advise the Board of Supervisors and incorporates public input, staff expertise to resolve outstanding issues with an application. And then the final step is the Board of Supervisors that ultimately approves the application, or in this case, rewrite. So that's what happens with a typical development application. However, the zoning ordinance rewrite, like said, is not exactly contiguous to this. It's been a very lengthy process that has been going on for multiple years, and there have been a lot of bumps in the road along the line. So we're going to go into the actual zoning ordinance rewrite process, go over a little bit how this might differ from the typical development application, and give you guys a background of where we've been in this process since it started back in 2020. So our executive director, Michael Myers, is actually going to go over the history of the zoning ordinance rewrite process since its conception a couple of years ago. So go ahead and take it away whenever you are ready, Michael.
Great, thanks, Trinity. And so, first of all, I think we just threw a lot of information at you. So, feel free to take a deep breath. It is complex, and so this is part of the reason why we want to have this Advocacy 101 section, because we've been communicating via email, and we're in the weeds. So we'll use a lot of jargon, and we try not to as much as possible, and we try to synthesize all of that information and then give it to you all in bite-sized pieces where you can understand and then have the comfort and confidence to be able to submit comments and participate in this public process. So the keystone of our government is public involvement and public engagement. And that's a core component of our organization. We want to engage you, we want to motivate you, and we want to inspire you to get involved. So that's at the core of what we do. And so it's a lot. And that's why we also brought on board Trinity as our Conservation Advocacy Specialist to help break all this down and to educate you all more and provide you with the tools you need to be an advocate and a voice for wildlife habitat. And so, with this zoning ordinance rewrite process, the comprehensive plan was approved in 2019, and that was a years-long process. So there were many stakeholder groups involved. It took many years, and we got in some things that we wanted to, and other things we pushed for we didn't get. And it's the same with everything. It's a negotiation, and it's the same here within this process. But as we were told at that time, some of the things we were pushing for, they're like, well, it's a policy document, so we purposely left it vague and open to interpretation. Well, they're like, the zoning ordinance is the right place for that, what you're talking about. Well, here we are. So we want to give some teeth to these regulatory documents so they can actually enforce and implement the comprehensive plan. And so it's a huge document. The current zoning ordinance, I don't have the figure off the top of my head. It's over 1,000 pages. It's a clunky document because it hasn't been updated in many years. And so there's a lot that's going on into this process. So we'll just kind of break down some of the steps and how we've been involved. And then we'll get to how you all can get involved now that we're kind of getting towards the end. Though we still have many months to go. So back in the first quarter of 2020, there was a round one of public input. And so originally this first round, there was going to be, the idea was to have a series of rounds of public input from stakeholder groups. And they were originally hoping to be completed by December 2020. Of course, we all know what happened. COVID happened. It threw a huge monkey wrench in everything. But in 2020, of these stakeholder groups, one of the representatives of the stakeholder group was the Loudoun County Preservation and Conservation Coalition. So that's our guest speaker, Maura, is on that coalition. I'm an active member of the coalition as well. So I'll refer to it as the coalition. But with that, the coalition is a loose collection of many nonprofit groups and organizations that are interested in preservation and conservation in Loudoun County, both in the eastern part of the county and the western part of the county. And so with that, Maura has been our stakeholder representative. And so what she's done is an excellent job in feeding information to the members of the coalition. And then so we can break down the chapters of the zoning ordinance that are important and relevant to our particular organization, and then feed her back information that she was able to collect and present to county staff. So in that way, we as members of the coalition were able to take those deep dives into that text and then provide lots of feedback to her, because it's a huge monumental task. And then there are many other stakeholder groups with other interests. So, whether it's the Regional Building Association or the Rural Economic Development Council, there's various other groups that are also represented. So we're not the only voice at the table. We're one of many. So then with COVID, everything, the schedule got thrown out the window essentially, and just got bogged down, and nothing really went as planned. But so what happened was then in the beginning of 2021, we got around to a second round of public input, and the second round still wasn't as deep of a dive into the text as we originally thought or anticipated. But we were still able to concentrate, what are the themes that we're seeing that we would like to see in a new ordinance? Because with the ordinance currently, it's a static document on the website, and you can search through it. It's a massive, or you can download it as a massive PDF. So that not only are they updating the ordinance, they're updating the whole style of how it works. So it's going to a new system called Encode Plus, which is easier to search and is more online friendly, but it still has a big learning curve because everything's new and different. So part of the process that staff had to undertake was just and consultant was taking that text and translating it into this new system, which was a huge lift for county staff. And then, so after these first two initial rounds of stakeholder input, there's a committee, an advisory committee, which was formerly called the Zoning Ordinance Advisory Group, or ZOAG. And that's an advisory committee to the Board of Supervisors. There are many of them. That's one of them, but it got reformed as ZOC, so the Zoning Ordinance Committee, which is basically tasked with providing recommendations to the Planning Commission. It's from the Planning and Zoning Department, and Maura can correct me if I'm stating that incorrectly. But so they work with staff, and so staff is feeding them draft text to provide comments on things that all those stakeholders would like the Planning Commission to review in further detail. And so with that, over many months, ZOC was reviewing these portions of draft text. And so along the way, Maura, as a representative for the coalition, was passing along these chunks of draft text, and they would be, 100 pages at a time, sometimes more, sometimes less. And we would have, a matter of days to less than a week to read it all, compare it to all of our feedback, all of our pre-work that we did, and all of our concerns, and to say, hey, we had this concern, it was not addressed. And so we would forward comments on to Maura, and she would collect them and submit them as part of the ZOC process. So our voices were heard along the way. And so that was a very long process, and a lot of reading and a lot of writing and a lot of comparing previous drafts to current drafts, and a lot of tedious activities and a lot of heavy mental brain power. And so with that, that was around the time where we were getting some funding to hire a conservation advocacy specialist, which was great for us, but still a lot of work. And so after the ZOC review ended, that's when staff finally released draft text of the actual document, because up until that point, it was all part of this stakeholder process. And so the draft text wasn't released to the general public. It is public information and, government transparency. Anybody can follow and plug into the ZOC committee meetings and watch them and get the documents and wade into it. But unless you had a stakeholder, unless you were one of the stakeholders and a member of the ZOC committee, you weren't an active part of that process. So we've been an active part of the process since the beginning, which is great news, as we'll get to in a few minutes. But so then that 90-day public comment period opened, and then we had, I don't even want to know, because it was those 1,000+ pages of text that all of a sudden, here's the draft document. What are your comments? And so what we did at that point with Trinity was on the back end, we have a lot of spreadsheets that are tracking, what are our concerns? What is our recommendation? And then was that recommendation incorporated into the actual draft text of the zoning ordinance? And then so we compared all of that, and I hope I'm not stealing too much of Maura's thunder, but we had, she ran the figures and the calculations. And
don't do that. Don't do that.
We'll wait. Okay. But we're tracking all of that on what was incorporated, what wasn't incorporated. So that's just, I want to give you all some of this background, because that's the intense lift on the back end. And so as part of our zoning ordinance, our Advocacy 101 sessions, we have kind of two main purposes for these sessions. We want to educate you all so you are confident, and so you can take those comments and submit them. But at the same time, if you're interested in getting into the weeds on this with us, we will gladly take your help. because it's a lot of reviewing these documents and these very technical documents, because they are regulations that are legally binding. So we were able to take all that information and package it. And that was what we published on our website, and we tried to break it down by chapter and section, to make it easy for the general public to understand what's important to us as a nonprofit organization protecting wildlife, and to see that our concerns and things that have changed in the comprehensive plan are actually going to be able to be implemented in the zoning ordinance, and by county staff. And so at that point, there's a 90-day public comment period, and then county staff has to take all that public input and decide, yes, we like that input, we'll put it into the document and change the draft text, or they can read it and say, I don't know, we don't know about that one. Or they can say, well, that's a nice thought, but here's why we disagree. And so, but county staff reads all of that input, they respond to that input. And so what they've done, and where we are now at the process, is they took all that input, and it was thousands of comments, and a lot of comments from members of the Loudoun Coalition. And so what county staff did is that they took, they developed these themes on what was written. So the more of our members who submitted comments, the more those themes rose to the top. And that's really important, because we as an organization, we're in front of the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission all of the time. And it's been stated in not so many words. Sometimes some of those members get a little sick of seeing the same old people in front of them talking about the same old things. And so it could be interpreted that, you know, our voices are getting lost as noise, because we're always standing up, we're always doing the right thing, but it's always the same faces and the same tone, and all that. So where our power comes in, and where the real power is with the people, and that resides with you, it resides with our members and with our volunteers. So when you are able to digest the information that we're putting out there, and you can form your opinions and take that information and make your comments, those comments add up, and then all of a sudden, our concerns aren't just our concerns. They're concerns from every single district in the county, and every single supervisor then has skin in the game, that their constituents care about wildlife. They care about trees and native plants and protecting riparian areas and wildlife corridors. It's not an Eastern versus Western Loudoun issue. It's a Loudoun County issue that people everywhere in the county care about. And so with that, so with what staff was doing, is they packaged together these reports for the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors. And so I'll kick it back over to Trinity here in a second, because that's where we are now in the process, is that they released, because the document is so big, they released one section of it for the Planning Commission public hearing, and they will be releasing another section in the future. And so we, as they release that, that's when we do a deep dive again to say, look back at those spreadsheets we have in the background and say, these were the topics and the issues that we had. Was it addressed? If so, great, we can thank them for addressing it. If not, we need to keep pushing on it. And then looking at those themes that county staff has provided, they're using those themes as prompts for the planning commissioners to say, hey, Planning Commission, we received a lot of feedback on this, and we're not sure what the best route is to take. And so those are things for us to reinforce at the public hearing for the Planning Commission to say, yes, the citizens of Loudoun do care about these things. Here is our recommendation and solution to solve this question. And so that's where we are at this process. And I'll kick it back over to Trinity.
Yeah, so Michael explained it fairly concisely. That's where we are now. We've come a long way. I know, like he prefaced his statement, I'll preface the same way. I know we're throwing a lot at you tonight, but we just want to do our best to give you a good background of where we've been so far, and hopefully that will encourage you to get involved with where we're going. So currently, right now, we are in the Planning Commission stage of the zoning ordinance rewrite. Like Michael said, the Planning Commission is reviewing the draft text of the zoning ordinance rewrite in sections, in work sessions, that, as you can see, will be taking place as of right now through February of 2023, and undergoing a Planning Commission hearings that are taking place with sections of the draft text to allow for those instances of input to happen for this portion of the draft. Currently, we are in between hearings, still waiting for the most recent draft text to be released, with the next public hearing scheduled tentatively for late January. And we will give you a little bit more information on that later. So just to give you a little idea of what will happen at the end of the process, I wanted to invite our guest speaker for the evening just to give us a little bit of an input on the end of the process before she will come back in a few minutes and give us some more details on her experiences thus far. So Mara, I'll kick it over to you to give an explanation of the very end of the process that is coming up soon.
Okay. Actually, after the January public hearing, there will still be more Planning Commission work sessions. So although the schedule goes to February right now, we can sort of anticipate if the next public hearing is not until January, you can probably bet that the work sessions will be going on beyond February. But what is currently on the Department of Zoning schedule is that the Board of Supervisors would receive the information sometime in the summer, and it's cut off a little bit on your screen, but right under the approval on the screen, it does say technically summer 2023. So we go by what is officially published, but the second public hearing was originally supposed to be the beginning of December. Then it was December 12th. Now it's the end of January. So I think we can all kind of do the math there. So we will still expect that the Board of Supervisors will be receiving it sometime in late spring, and then they will have their opportunity to be able to do what would be a deep dive with the Transportation Land Use Committee, or TLUC, and then the board would have its vote. When that will be, we will all stay tuned to the calendar.
Sure, and I do apologize that it is cut off on the bottom of my screen. I am not quite sure why.
At least it is on mine. I don't know.
Oh, if you can't see it, then I am assuming that most people can't either. I do apologize for that. It does seem that my taskbar at the bottom of the screen is staying present.
No worries, because
That's
who
okay.
knows if it's really going to be summer.
That's fair, exactly. Well, thank you, Maura, for giving us that overview of the end of the process. So I will go ahead and formally introduce you as our guest speaker for the evening. So here to talk about what's next with the zoning ordinance rewrite process, as well as go over some successes and challenges that have been faced thus far in the process, is Mara Walsh-Copeland. She is the Zoning Ordinance Committee member representing the Preservation Conservation Organization stakeholder group. So informally, that stakeholder group is known as the coalition, as Michael explained earlier, of which Loudoun County Conservancy is a part. Mara has been involved in the zoning ordinance rewrite since the beginning of the process, back in June 2019, and has been integral to advocating for environmental best interests in each stage of the ZOR thus far. She is here tonight to share some successes, challenges, and experience that she has had to show you guys what the process has been like, and also give a little bit of an overview of what to expect going forward through the rest of the process, hopefully with the aim of encouraging you guys to get involved to advocate for wildlife. So go ahead and take it away, Mara. And
Great.
if you want to just let me know when you're ready
Yeah.
to switch to the next slide. I will
Sure,
hit it
next
for you.
slide.
All right.
So thank you so much for having me tonight, Trinity and Michael. As they explained, this really has been a 3-year process, and it still has at least 6 to 9 months to go. And as requested, I'll try to highlight some of the successes and challenges, but hopefully make it not sound too daunting. There has been a lot that has gone on, but there is some method to some of the madness. And one of the biggest successes was getting involved at the very beginning with the comprehensive plan and getting on board with the zoning ordinance rewrite very, very early in the process, even before COVID. That was a wonderful opportunity for LWC. My original ZOR project goals were for all the organizations, all the stakeholder groups that I deal with, and there's at least 40 of them and well over hundreds of people, was to inform, to identify what the issues were, to facilitate that stakeholder input process, and manage a clearer process of documenting the requirements and recommendations to go to staff. And the key was keeping the public input and requirements in the forefront of the county throughout the entire stages and the rounds of review through the zoning ordinance committee, that is the ZOC meetings, and always being reminding staff and the planning commission of the interests of the stakeholders such as LWC, and also to help you provide your 90-day public input, because as Michael said, it's not only about the managers, it is about the actual voices of the citizens that really, really matter to the county. And so the key challenge and the opportunity will be to continue to pay attention and stay engaged. So next slide. Are you you'll advance? Oh, there we go. So this is the one that I've used for a while. And initially the public input felt very much like everyone was in a hurricane. But actually, this was quite an organized process to help LWC and other groups to develop their requirements. And many times citizens will jump straight to complaints and emotions without necessarily understanding or articulating what they think needs to change. So that's going from the policy that Trinity was talking about to the regulations. Well, first let's figure out what are the needs, what has to change, what was going wrong. And that required doing some homework. And it definitely does help to do that homework on the front end, because it does produce a more professional input that is better received and better understood. So first was to take all the citizen input and to do the issues needed, all the issues needed some description for accuracy. And then they were documented to identify which regulations really needed to match the policies. And that's what Michael was talking about earlier. And he did really do a tremendous amount of work there. Groups were asked to prepare case studies, because one of the best ways of actually demonstrating a need is to describe it with real life examples. And with those case studies, it helped determine some solutions and recommendations, rather than just leaving it up to staff to determine what the solution was on their own. So don't just tell them what the problem is, but give a recommendation or a solution. And I've definitely heard that groups felt that they were not equipped to do all this work. But in reality, although Michael just did say that it was technical, the work really was not technical. It didn't require math or engineering or science. It did require reading to understand. It did require some documenting requirements. It required dedication, but the biggest thing that it required was time. And next slide, Trinity. I'm very thankful for all the time that LWC and other groups spent on the requirement stage, because that time resulted in specific recommendations that were helpful for staff to consider and harder for them to ignore. The case studies and the input from all areas was posted on a public website for facilitated sharing. And this is just a screen clip of it. And it was done shortly after COVID. So the availability of all the information and all the requirements was a key success to providing the input during the challenging time of an unexpected pandemic. And I have been told a number of times that the website was actually monitored and reviewed by staff throughout the zoning ordinance process, especially during COVID when staff were all at home writing their draft text. So it turned out to be a helpful stage in the process. Next. So the goal was to provide the requirements on the front end of the zoning ordinance rewrite. And it was also, while other groups, as Michael said, were providing stakeholder input as well, and county staff. So we did have some competition. So whoever produced the most coherent and best thought out and best documented got more attention. It was also an important way for LWC, as Michael mentioned earlier, to be prepared for the multiple rounds of input, because you were able to go back to that very early documented requirement stage and keep coming back and say, did we get it? Did we not? And to be able to watch and compare with other input to determine whether it was used or ignored with county staff drafts. So that was definitely a success. And next slide. And the schedule that you saw earlier showed that the public input documentation stage basically is completed. All the actual writing stages that LWC was asked to do and all the groups were asked to do, that's basically done, because since August, we are now in the state mandated public review stage that relies more on the standard public hearing process. And that's what Trinity was going through earlier. It is more similar to the development application process. And it's what I call the 2 minutes of fame stage, where you get to speak for 2 minutes and hope that they got the point. But that's where it honestly, waiting to only give public input at that stage is kind of like playing whack-a-mole on the back end, watching whether draft text changes are being made at the request of competing stakeholder groups. So, everyone else is out making their case as well. So having the documentation be the first thing that they received, and that the public input verbally is reinforcing, is also working out to be helpful and successful. So individuals and groups at this stage received a number of tips, and the tips basically still apply, and it's intended to help bump up the volume of LWC's input so that it is continued to be heard and continued to be considered and make it to the final stage. So what was requested then and still requested now is that each stage is for members to plan to highlight what you care about most. And that's where, as Michael said, they don't want to only see the same faces. So for each of the members in your organization, it's good that you pick different aspects of what you care most about, because the zoning ordinance rewrite, as Michael said, it still is. It was 1,100 pages. It's now maybe only a 1,000, but we don't know yet. We've not seen it all in one document. So one of the best things that I've said to people is the table of contents is your best friend, because it helps you determine your starting point and finding the regulations that LWC should really weigh in on. And then obviously is what we were talking about earlier, is that yes, it does require some homework. It's not technical, but it does require some reading and some comparing. So manpower wise, it would be extremely beneficial if Michael and Trinity had additional eyeballs doing some of that reading and comparing. I can say that I could not possibly have done the volume of work over the last 3 years if I didn't have the eyeballs of all the stakeholder groups simultaneously. So if LWC input is included in the next draft, as Michael already said, the best thing to do is to say thank you, because you want to make sure that staff hears the thank you and doesn't remove it because somebody else wants it out. And if it did not make it into the next draft after your review, then that is your new comment. That is what you would say in your 2-minute speech with a justification that I know that Michael and Trinity will be helping to LWC members to summarize. And, comments can be in the form of verbal input at the public hearing, but it also can be letters or emails before a hearing or a work session. So you're not allowed to speak before a planning commission work session, but you can send emails and letters. So there's still an opportunity to weigh in, even at those stages that we are at right now, as we heard that they're going to be definitely having work sessions through February. And I'm going to predict, with my crystal ball having batteries tonight, that it's going to be longer than that. So Trinity will be highlighting tips at the next Advocacy 101 course of how to do some of that writing. And obviously you need to be sure to share your information. It's so much harder if everyone is trying to do it separately. To really make it go viral is to share your information so that friends and neighbors who also have your same concerns can put it in their own words and also reinforce it, because whether we like it or not, volume does count. And the loudness of the request will matter in the end, as it goes all the way to the Board of Supervisors. And making your comments factual but personal, and adding a story as an example is often extremely effective and very, very helpful. And some of those stories is why we did case studies 3 years ago, because some of the best stories are already documented. You don't have to come up with them from the ground up. And so next slide. Finally, the key challenges are for all of this, especially after this time, is to continue to pay attention and stay engaged, because it really has been 3 long years. But we are nearing the end. So keeping in touch with all of the LWC electronic notices for key issues and when to communicate, watching that schedule. I provide the most current schedule on my website constantly. And so it is a constant ongoing trying to stay updated. The results of the April to July 90-day public input, I will say that the county was amazed that they received over 4,000 comments. Yes, there were some from other stakeholders, but LWC was very well represented. I can tell you, because I was able to see them, and you can also read them yourself too. They are available. So far, for the first set of chapters, this is what I told Michael not to steal my thunder, but I calculated, based upon all the different requests, that approximately 60% of the comments that have been submitted through all my project teams were addressed. And those are really good odds. So let's hope for the same for the second batch, but that says that you're not still trying to advocate for 100% of your requests. Maybe you're looking for the last 30% of what we didn't get. That's a big difference in terms of scoping what you want to say at a public hearing, or those letters and emails that you want to write, and staying engaged to reinforce the highest priority requirements. Because as we get further down, that yes, maybe there were 30% that did not get addressed, but it's that last 10% that will really matter. So continuing to focus on what are the highest priority requirements for LWC, and it would also boost the success rate overall, and really help with all of your input. And again, it does take time, and I would like to first say thank you for all of your time.
Well, thank you so much, Maura. That was very, very helpful. Really, really good information. And thank you for sharing some of your experiences. I hope that that gave you all a more well-rounded view of what the process has been like so far, and hopefully opened your eyes that it's not as scary as it seems. It can be a little overwhelming. There's a lot of content surrounding it, but really it's doable with the right amount of motivation and participation. So just to segue a little ways into how you guys can get involved. You all are here tonight, presumably because you care about wildlife and you are interested in learning about the zoning ordinance and how this process is impacting our wildlife and what you can do to help protect our wildlife during this process. So when it comes to playing your part and getting involved, the first thing you can do is participate in the public process. Signing up to speak at public hearings, writing your representative. People power is immensely important. I cannot really hone in on that enough, of the magnitude being something that really will make a difference. And just like Maura gave that really good statistic earlier, about 60% of comments being addressed, that it's a really big deal. It might seem to people involved that 60% isn't a lot, but it is a lot when you come down to the weeds of it, especially with regards to how much content there is. And that's thanks to people like you that really did participate and give your comments and show your support for the work that we have done thus far. But like has been outlined, that work is not done yet. We still have a fair ways to go in this process, and we still have a lot of fighting to do for that wildlife protection. So that brings me into the second element of how you guys can get involved. Volunteering is immensely important. Not only is people power important in actually bolstering your comments and really honing in and emphasizing how important they are, but people power is important when it comes to the number of people involved in the process, that we can actually have the capacity to focus on the issues that matter. So people power, but also brain power. I like how Maura referred to it as the eyeballs on the paper. It might sound a little arbitrary, but it really is important. Like we said, these documents are pretty massive, and splitting up the work actually helps us to really be able to emphasize the parts that matter. So we really encourage you to sign up to be a zoning advocate volunteer. Help us to weed through some of this draft text, do those review and comparisons to help identify some priority items that have or haven't been addressed. Help us thank the county for addressing what has been addressed thus far, and write recommendations for further wildlife protection that should be implemented in this process.
So Trinity, we do have a question in the chat, and I may be able to take a crack at this, but George asks, how would you compare your effectiveness in positively influencing the product compared with other environmental advocates, such as the Piedmont Environmental Council, Waterford Foundation, et cetera? And I can take a crack at that, and I don't know if Maura might
Sure.
want to say something as
Yeah.
well.
Yes.
But I would say I don't know that I want to compare our effectiveness, but together we were effective. And I know Maura, as Maura mentioned, she reads more of the comments once they've been submitted than I have. But I do know that a lot of the themes and things that were important to our organization were regarded in themes, but we were working as a member of the coalition and stakeholder groups. It was really the power of all of us that were able to get it done. So we definitely were effective. And so I'll leave it up to Maura if she has any thoughts.
Yeah,
but
I will clarify, the 60% does not reflect just LWC's comments. It is the composite of all the preservation and conservation organizations together. So it was the power of LWC and PEC and Waterford Foundation and all the other conservation groups together that had similar comments over and over again that helped get it to 60%. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, I hope that answered your question, George. That fairly nicely. I did want to have another call for questions. I have one more slide and then I'll open the floor if there's anything else that anyone wants to discuss or ask questions about. We have a lot of experts here that can help answer them. So just to wrap up, for as far as engagement goes and the part that you all can play in this process. So the Zoning Ordinance Rewrite second Planning Commission public hearing is tentatively scheduled for January 24th of next year. This has been delayed, so it's still very tentative. However, we are anticipating the need for some public engagement come then. This graphic right here is again a tentative schedule as of mid-November of the Planning Commission work schedule with regards to the work sessions that will come through and the rest of the zoning ordinance rewrite process. So a second draft text of chapters that will be released with the next work session packet will be coming soon. And like I said, we really do encourage you guys to get involved as much as you can. If it comes to you being someone that is interested in volunteering and helping us weed through these documents and go through them, then we do encourage you to sign up as a zoning ordinance advocate volunteer, and we will send you more information as that comes. Likewise, just stay informed on the process. Even if you don't feel you have the capacity to read those documents, still making sure that you're staying informed so that you can make your voice heard when that time for public input arises is incredibly important. And we are committed to keeping you involved and updated on that process.
And Trinity, I'll just mention that, as I mentioned earlier, that the table of contents is your best friend. And if you look at what the chapters are going to be for the January 24th public hearing, the ones you're going to care about most, the ones that you're going to go look for first, will be ones that are Chapter 6, Natural and Environmental Resources, Chapter 7, Open Space. But there could be some folks that also might be very interested in some of the uses and use-specific standards. So that's another opportunity to be able to say who cares about what most and divide and conquer. And then the way that you would use this schedule, and it will be continued to post, is if you cared about the Chapter 6, well, then what is the work session that you want to really pay attention to? Well, it would be the one that would be Chapter 6. And right now it says it's going to be in January. So this is just a tool to be able to make sure that you're staying engaged at the right time, because you wouldn't want to find out too late.
Yeah, for sure. And that is also a really good point that Mara makes, is that, like I said, it's a complex document and it's a lot, but you can break it up into bite-sized chunks. When we are doing our call to action and asking for volunteers and asking for your participation in the public process as a whole, we understand capacity is a concern for every individual. So honing in on what really is most important to you is obviously a really good consideration, is a really valid way to go about this process.
And Trinity, I would also like to add that one of the things that we're doing is we're in our comments and recommendations that we're making, we're including the very specific section numbers for these sections to make it easier for you all to find that information in those sections, because as you can imagine, as Maura pointed out, the natural and environmental resources section is going to have a lot of things we're interested in. And same with the open space. And so we'll provide down to the very specific section numbers. So then if you are wondering about, well, what does it actually say? You can easily search for it and find it and go to that very specific one. And in that way, the comments and the feedback can be more pointed. And so it's not, I'm probably not going to state this as eloquently as Maura did, but it's you're making your voice heard, but you're also making it harder to ignore.
Yes.
So that more specificity, and that's part of the reason why we're including that too. We don't want to make some vague glowing term like we must protect the trees. It's going to be, section chapter 6, section 1.07, tree preservation, native plants, and have a very pointed comment there, because that's going to be most valuable for staff to actually change that text, and they'll know exactly what text you're talking about. So it removes the confusion and makes it harder to ignore.
And I would say, I would agree that the time for glittering generalities is over. The time for specifics is still here. And I have been saying now for over 2 years, don't think of this as a book. You don't read it from front to back. You read it from index or table of contents and really go at what's really important to you.
Oh,
and with that, I think, Trinity, we can segue to the next slide, which is why, as we've designed this series, we've had this zoning ordinance rewrite process in mind for this whole Advocacy 101 series. So the next section is going to be writing your supervisor, and also it applies to your planning commissioner as well. And so this will be on January 25th, which is probably going to be just after that public hearing for the planning commission, but it'll probably be before their work sessions, and it will be before this item goes to the Board of Supervisors. And so we'll have the one in January is writing, and then the one in February is going to be speaking. So we're trying to prepare you to succeed and shine in both writing your elected officials, but then also speaking in front of them. And as Maura mentioned, at the end, the speaking is really your 2 minutes to shine at the end, but the work gets done in writing before it gets to that period.
Definitely.
Gets to that point. So I know we have a couple questions in the chat. Trinity, before we go to questions, did you want to say anything else?
I don't think so. Just thank you all for coming, and I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so I can see your faces as we move into Q&A. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
All right, and then I'll read the ones in the chat since I know your screen has been full. But the first one from Michael Hendler was, does the zoning ordinance mention Loudoun Parks siting and style, or does all of that belong to the Parks Board? That's a great question. Maura might have a better answer for me, but there are standards and regulations in the zoning ordinance. For some items, it goes into other regulatory documents. So in many cases, the specifics of siting and style will be in the facility standards manual.
Right.
So I believe that's also the case for parks. Correct me if I'm wrong, Maura.
For the most part, yes. And that's why understanding that this zoning ordinance, we're working on one of the 3 documents that will create the regulations. The other 2 documents will also have to be updated, and they're not quite scheduled yet. So, and they all need to coordinate and work together. So yes, it's complex, especially for parks, because of also the linear parks and trails is separate.
Yep. And yeah, and to add on to that, so I mean, the zoning ordinance is the regulatory framework, which is the legal law on that. And then, so the facility standards manual has to comply with the regulations in the zoning ordinance. So as Maura just mentioned, that will happen after this is complete, but it's intricately tied together. And then there's documents such as the Linear Parks and Trails Framework Plan, which came out of the work of the Emerald Ribbons Committee. And that's just an adopted policy document and a set of guidelines for the Parks and Rec staff to follow, but it doesn't hold any legal standing for regulations other than the board has formally adopted it. So that's what the Parks and Rec staff is using as their guidelines, but it doesn't have that legal authority. So it's important to get it right in the zoning ordinance. The point being, it's important to get it right in the zoning ordinance because it will have a cascading effects on the other documents.
Sure.
Um,
I answered David Ward's question. There's a wonderful, wonderful story map on the river stream corridor, but there isn't one for Mountainside.
Thank you,
Yet.
Maura. Yes. And so, yeah, I had another thought, but I'll just leave that be for now. And that's one of the things, speaking of mountainsides, the Friends of the Blue Ridge Mountains is another member of the Loudoun Coalition. And we are working with them on they're specifically, speaking about passion, interested in the Mountainside Overlay District. I mean, they're the Friends of the Blue Ridge Mountains. So they're taking sort of a deeper dive into that and working to have some coordinated collective voices to elevate the education about the Mountainside Overlay District and what we would like, what a lot of the environmental community would like to see protected there. So that's another example of one of our local groups drilling into their passion and then collaborating with others so we stay on message and stay on point, and we're able to elevate the voices of that group, because we certainly agree with pretty much everything that they have to, their recommendations for the Mountainside Overlay District, we're on board with. So we want to elevate their voices and share their content because they have a team of people that are doing a deep dive into that in particular.
And the key word there is share.
And then from George, we have, are you incorporating the UN Sustainable Development Goals? A short answer is not exactly. A slightly more complicated answer is yes, in a roundabout way.
Or not yet.
Or not yet. So it's something that I know I had to look at them and incorporate them into a grant that we did for Microsoft because we're getting funding from Microsoft, and they're partnering with the Society for Ecological Restoration, and their goals are tied to all the UN sustainability goals. So I know that that's something that we are doing in some aspects of our work in direct correlation to the zoning ordinance rewrite process. Maybe not necessarily, but I could also make the argument that a lot of the work we're doing feeds into those goals. So maybe not directly, but more indirectly.
And I would say that a lot of work was done with those case studies and the documentation requirements that were on the website 2.5 years ago. All that information has been provided to the county, and they were policies in the comprehensive plan for sustainability, but you won't see them in the zoning ordinance yet. They have said that it's a bit too much that they can bite off. And there are a number of things that if you think it's all going to be in one zoning ordinance, unfortunately, it's not. It's going to be subsequent, another Z word, ZOAMs. After the zoning ordinance is done, there will be additional efforts to do other things that they couldn't get done in time. And doing a deep dive into all the sustainability policies, because it was going to be so intricately woven into so many, is one of those that they're saying is going to be a separate ZOAM.
Yeah, that's a great point, Maura. I think in our quest not to complicate things too much,
you're not going to get everything.
There's a series that are already of zoning ordinance amendments that are already being planned, yeah. Because it is so complex, and solar is one of those. Right. There are a number of them already planned.
And dark sky in some places. I think they're trying to get as much as they can in, but if you don't see it, that could be why. The question to ask is, are you going to get it now? Or are we going to get it later? Don't assume it's a never.
And yeah, and that ties back to one of your last slides in your presentation, Maura, is that we need to stay alert and keep paying attention, because once the zoning ordinance rewrite gets done, there's still gonna, this is gonna be ongoing, because there's gonna be zoning ordinance amendments. But then there's also going to be the facility standards manual. So that's why our advocacy program, it's a program that's ongoing. And so while we want to be aggressive with things, we also need to be patient. And part of our goal as an organization is to understand what's happening in the background with county government and trying to pass that information along to you as best as we can, to help you all understand where they are in the process. Because bringing out the pitchforks on something too early when the county's planning on doing it later doesn't do any of us any good. It's not helpful. So while we might not want to wait, sometimes we do, and we have to let the process play out. And we're playing the long game, which can be frustrating, especially in a world with so much immediate gratification these days. But it's really important to get it right, and that's why some of these topics are so complex that once you codify the zoning ordinance, it's more difficult to change it later. It still can be, and does change later, but it's better to get it right from the beginning than to mess it up, because you don't have all the input and information you need. And then, so we had another question from Tanya. Will the link to this recording be shared with those of us in attendance? The answer is yes. We'll also be posting it onto our YouTube channel. So then it'll be out there. So you can absolutely share it with your friends, neighbors, other groups in other counties. Things may be slightly different, but it's still relevant, probably to anybody in Virginia, because the process will be more or less the same.
I answered Natalie's question whether or not the sustainability ZOM is scheduled, and it's not. And will I keep you posted? Since I've been reappointed to the Zoning Ordinance Committee, I have 4 more years. So yes, I will.
Yep. And so and with that, as Maura has alluded to, the Loudoun Coalition has a website, and it's loudouncoalition.org. And on there's a zoning page, and that was a screenshot of the page in her presentation. So if you do want to do a deeper dive, there's a ton of great information and resources there. And if you all have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to us, and we can point you in the right direction, because a lot of this information is on the website. It can be overwhelming because there are, I don't know, more 40 different, there's a lot of different white papers and information, but if there's something specific, we can help point you into the right direction to help.
Yes, and this is not a one and done kind of thing with LWC, and you can see that there's going to be many more opportunities to touch this process. And one thing that I do with a lot of the different groups, when there's sufficient requests and confusion or where to find things, is to have what I call prep talks, so that if you're not sure where to go or how to go about it, we can have a short prep talk with Loudoun Wildlife members to be able to get you on the right track more quickly.
Awesome. Thanks, Maura. Are there any other questions? Cool. Well, Trinity, do you want to close this out?
Yeah, for sure. I didn't see any other questions in the chat. Well, I want to thank you all for coming so much. I greatly appreciate you taking the time to learn about a really important issue that is happening in our county right now. And you're welcome, Linda. Thank you. And I look forward to working hopefully with some of you going forward with some of the work that we're doing to advocate for wildlife with regards to this zoning ordinance rewrite. So thank you all for your time this evening. It was wonderful to meet those of you that I haven't yet. And I look forward to working with you going forward. I hope you all have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.